She said my ranch gate wasn't HOA compliant. It was a solid steel gate, battleship gray, 12 feet wide, hung between two 18-inch diameter steel posts, sunk 6 feet into concrete. A gate I'd fabricated myself. A gate that could probably stop a runaway 18-wheeler. It guarded the entrance to my 100 acres, a property my family had worked for 3 generations before this ticky-tacky subdivision. Whispering Pines Estates sprouted like a fungus on its eastern border. Now, apparently, my gate, a quarter-mile from the nearest actual Whispering Pines resident, offended the aesthetic sensibilities of one Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth, HOA president, self-appointed guardian of taupe conformity. She shouldn't have picked a fight with the guy who designs and builds military-grade excavation and earth-moving systems for a living. The irony was, apparently, lost on her. For now, this initial salvo, a crisp cream envelope bearing the HOA's pretentious logo, landed on my workshop bench with the deceptive weight of a much larger ordinance. It simply declared my gate a monument to robust engineering and a clear demarcation of here be dragons to any unwelcome solicitor. A Tier 3 aesthetic violation. The stakes were clear. My home, my legacy. The simple right to have a gate that looked like it meant business, because it did. The letter implied my hidden power, my actual profession, was irrelevant. It suggested justice, in her world, was a matter of paint swatches and prescribed shrubbery. It ended with a demand for immediate remediation proposals. I already had one in mind. It just wasn't for the gate. The formal violation notice arrived, registered mail, a document thick with self-importance and riddled with references to bylaws. I was certain Eleanor herself had penned during a particularly potent Chardonnay-fueled evening. It cited Section 4, subsection B, Paragraph 7. All entryway demarcations must adhere to pre-approved design palettes and material specifications, as detailed in Appendix G. Appendix G, I later discovered, was a single, coffee-stained page featuring 3 sketches of flimsy wrought iron gates, better suited to a dollhouse. My gate, it seemed, was too substantial, too secure, too much like it belonged to someone who didn't intend to be trifled with. I dialed the number listed for the HOA president. Eleanor Ainsworth answered on the second ring, her voice a brittle confection of forced pleasantries. Whispering Pines, HOA. Eleanor speaking. How may I illuminate your day? I introduced myself. The pleasantries evaporated like morning mist on hot asphalt. Ah, Mr. Thorne, regarding your structure. She called my gate a structure, as if it were an unauthorized oil derrick. I'm calling about the notice, Mrs. Ainsworth. It seems rather vague on the specifics of the non-compliance, beyond a general dislike for its existence. My tone was studiously neutral, the kind I used when a junior engineer tried to explain how a multi-ton hydraulic ram had somehow just slipped. Vague? Her voice tightened. Mr. Thorne, it's patently obvious your edifice does not conform. It's an eyesore. It lowers property values. It's entirely unsuitable for a community of our standing. I let the silence hang for a moment, picturing her perfectly coiffed hair, her rigidly tasteful beige ensemble, the faint tremor of indignation in her grip on the receiver. Mrs. Ainsworth, I said, my voice dropping half an octave, my property predates your HOA by 70 years. That gate replaced a previous one that stood for 40. Perhaps you could specify precisely which material specification in Appendix G it violates. Steel, I believe, is quite durable. A sputtering sound came down the line. It's the overall aesthetic, Mr. Thorne. It's aggressive. Interesting choice of words. I was beginning to understand. This wasn't about a gate. This was about control. About her asserting dominance over a piece of land that, by its very existence, mocked her meticulously curated little kingdom. My inner strategist, the one who designed systems to move mountains or dig through bedrock, began to sketch preliminary operational parameters. Subject: Eleanor. Objective: re-education. My first operational phase was reconnaissance. The HOA's covenants, conditions, restrictions became my evening reading, spread across the massive oak table in my study, the same table where my grandfather planned his crop rotations. Laura, my wife, watched me with that look of patient concern she reserved for when I was about to embark on a project that involved either high explosives or intractable bureaucracy. "Are you sure this is worth it, Michael?" she asked, tracing the rim of her teacup. "It's just a gate." I looked up from a particularly convoluted clause regarding fence heights, a clause, I noted with grim satisfaction, that Eleanor's own perfectly manicured privet hedge along her back lot line seemed to gleefully ignore. "It's not about the gate, sweetheart. It's about the principle. She's testing boundaries. If I concede on this, what's next? The color of the barn? The type of livestock I'm allowed to think about?" Laura sighed but nodded. She understood. This ranch was our sanctuary, our legacy. It wasn't just land, it was marrow deep. Next, I called Marcus Thorne, my cousin, a man whose quiet demeanor belied a legal mind as sharp and unforgiving as a laser cutter. He specialized in contractual law and property disputes, with a particular fondness for dismantling petty tyrants. "HOA trouble, Mike?" he'd said, a hint of amusement in his voice. Figured it was only a matter of time before that pastel prison next door tried something. I laid out the situation. Marcus listened, asked a few pointed questions, then hummed thoughtfully. "Send me the CCRs and her notice. We'll draft a response that will make her regret learning to read." For the more granular intelligence, I turned to an old acquaintance, a local eccentric named Alistair Finch, but whom everyone called Digit. Digit was a retired signals intelligence analyst who now ran a small, cluttered electronics repair shop and possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of public records and online databases. He also harbored a deep-seated, almost philosophical loathing for HOAs, stemming from a long-lost battle over a satellite dish. "Eleanor Ainsworth," Digit mused, peering over his spectacles when I visited his shop, the air thick with the smell of ozone and old solder. "The Dowager Empress of Whispering Pines. Oh, I know her. Let me see what digital breadcrumbs she's left lying about." Within 24 hours, Digit had provided a dossier. Property lines meticulously plotted, a history of her complaints against other residents, many of them bordering on harassment, and, most deliciously, a satellite image showing her prize-winning rose garden was encroaching a good 2 feet onto common HOA land. Phase 1 complete. The enemy was identified, her positions mapped, her vulnerabilities assessed. Marcus, armed with Digit's intel and the CCRs, drafted our first official counteroffensive. The letter was a masterpiece of polite, implacable legality. It was printed on my company letterhead, subtly suggesting resources far beyond those of a typical homeowner. Each sentence was a carefully calibrated payload. We began by acknowledging receipt of her esteemed correspondence. Then, we politely requested clarification on precisely which subsection of Appendix G Mygate's specific materials, high-grade, powder-coated structural steel, allegedly violated, as steel was, by any reasonable engineering standard, a superior material to the flimsy wrought iron depicted. We noted the 70-year history of a substantial gate at that location, implying a pre-existing, non-conforming right that likely superseded any recently concocted aesthetic guidelines. We then, ever so gently, pivoted. We attached a copy of the county surveyor's plat map, highlighting my property lines, and cross-referenced it with Digit's satellite imagery, indicating her own rose garden's charming incursion onto common property. "Perhaps," Marcus had written, with a flourish I deeply admired, "while the committee reviews entryway demarcations, it might also find time to address existing encroachments by board members onto communal areas, ensuring equitable application of association standards." We didn't threaten, we merely inquired. The letter was sent via certified mail, return receipt requested, with copies to every other member of the HOA board, whose names and addresses Digit had helpfully provided. The effect was akin to dropping a small, precisely targeted smoke bomb into a hornet's nest. Eleanor's response, when it came, was not another formal letter. It was an email CC'd to the board, its tone several degrees hotter than her initial communication. The carefully constructed veneer of detached authority had cracked. She accused me of deflection and obfuscation. She insisted my gate was a clear and deliberate provocation. She conveniently ignored the part about her roses. Mr. Thorne, it concluded, your continued defiance will result in escalating fines and, if necessary, the placement of a lien against your property. This is your final warning to comply. Final warning. How quaint. I forwarded it to Marcus. His reply was succinct. She's rattled. Good. Now we wait for her to make a mistake. The other board members remained conspicuously silent. I imagined them nervously rereading their own bylaws, suddenly less certain of Eleanor's infallibility. The air in Whispering Pines had subtly shifted. The first shot had been fired, not with bluster, but with the cold, hard weight of documented fact. Eleanor, true to Marcus's prediction, did not take kindly to being legally outmaneuvered. Her response was to escalate, not with reasoned argument, but with the blunt instrument of her perceived authority. The fines began to arrive, weekly, like clockwork. $50 for failure to remediate aesthetic violation gate. Then another 50, cumulative. Notices, now on cheaper paper, stuffed directly into my ranch mailbox, bypassing the formality of the postal service, a petty act of territorial marking. She had, in her mind, drawn a line in the sand, or rather, across my driveway. She then expanded her campaign. A new notice appeared, unapproved commercial vehicle presence. This referred to my Ford F-350, a truck I used for, ranch work. Apparently, in Whispering Pines, only vehicles designed to transport organic kale and yoga mats were deemed acceptable. Another fine. Then, the truly egregious move, the one that shifted my internal calculus from defensive strategy to offensive countermeasures. Laura called me one afternoon, her voice tight with suppressed anger. Michael. She was here. Eleanor. I saw her from the kitchen window. She was on our property, near the tree line, taking pictures of the old chicken coop. The old chicken coop? It hadn't housed chickens in 20 years. It was dilapidated, yes, but it was 100 yards inside my property line, invisible from any road or neighboring Whispering Pines lot. It was, in short, none of her damned business. Trespassing. That was the moral crossing. She had physically violated our sanctuary. She's declared war, Michael, Laura said quietly when I got home, her eyes blazing with a protective fire I hadn't seen since a coyote once got too close to our collie. I nodded slowly. Yes, she has. And she's about to discover that some battles are best left unfought. My inner monologue was colder, more precise. Subject Ainsworth has escalated from bureaucratic harassment to direct territorial incursion. The parameters of engagement have been irrevocably altered. Standard protocols for nuisance abatement are now insufficient. Initiating Phase 2, proactive environmental recalibration. The neighbors in Whispering Pines were becoming a Greek chorus of nervous whispers. I'd seen a few sympathetic glances, a few hasty retreats when Eleanor was nearby. Digit reported that quiet grumbling about her autocratic style was growing louder in the cul-de-sacs. They were watching, waiting, perhaps hoping for a champion. They didn't know it yet, but ground preparation was about to begin. The beauty of owning a company that specializes in heavy-duty, precision earthmoving is that one occasionally finds compelling reasons for essential property improvements. I decided my ranch desperately needed a new, state-of-the-art French drain and culvert system along the eastern perimeter, precisely where my land abutted the pristine, manicured lawns of Whispering Pines. And, coincidentally, right alongside the property line shared with Eleanor Ainsworth's meticulously landscaped, though structurally dubious, back fence. I drew up the plans myself. Not back of the napkin sketches, but full engineering blueprints, complete with soil analysis, gradient calculations, and material specifications for Schedule 80 PVC and Class 5 gravel backfill. I submitted these to the county planning office. They were, of course, approved without comment. Such projects, designed for drainage and soil stabilization on private agricultural land, rarely raised an eyebrow, especially when presented with such professional thoroughness. The HOA bylaws, I noted with satisfaction, were conspicuously silent on subterranean drainage systems installed entirely on one's own property. I then dispatched a formal, courteous letter to the Whispering Pines HOA Board, CC Eleanor Ainsworth. Please be advised, it stated, that Thorn Ranch will be undertaking essential land improvement and excavation work along its eastern boundary, commencing on or about date 2 weeks hence. This work, fully compliant with all county regulations and permits, Permit 774 Anine B, is for the purpose of enhanced property drainage and long-term soil stabilization. We anticipate minimal disruption. No mention of fences, no mention of Eleanor, just a bland, factual statement of intent. For the job, I selected one of my company's more refined pieces of equipment, a Komatsu PC55MR, a compact excavator, but still weighing in at over 12.0 pounds. Agile enough for tight spaces, powerful enough to make its presence felt. My crew affectionately called this particular machine the Surgeon for its hydraulic precision. Laura raised an eyebrow when the flatbed delivered it. "Essential maintenance, Michael?" she asked, a small smile playing on her lips. "Absolutely, darling," I replied, patting the Surgeon's gleaming yellow boom. "Just ensuring the long-term structural integrity of our land. Can't be too careful with erosion, you know." My internal monologue was humming a different tune, a battle hymn of sorts. Phase 2. Site preparation. Objective: establish a clear and undeniable physical demarcation of territorial sovereignty and expose inherent structural weaknesses in opposing fortifications. Eleanor would, no doubt, be observing. I was counting on it. The morning of the excavation dawned bright and clear, the kind of crisp autumn day perfect for moving a little earth. My crew, a team of seasoned professionals who'd worked with me on projects from pipeline installations to sensitive environmental remediation, arrived at 7. They knew the official plan: install a high-capacity drainage system. They also knew me. There was an unspoken understanding, a certain glint in their eyes as they surveyed the property line, the pristine, Whispering Pines lawns on one side, my rugged pasture on the other, and Eleanor Ainsworth's rather ostentatious, 6-foot-tall white vinyl privacy fence separating her domain from mine. The Surgeon, gleaming in the early sun, rumbled to life with a satisfying diesel roar. We began work methodically, precisely along the surveyed property line, a good 3 feet inside my boundary. The bucket of the Surgeon, guided with surgical skill by my lead operator, bit into the earth, carving a neat trench. The soil was rich loam, easy digging. Eleanor Ainsworth, as anticipated, appeared on her patio, clad in a pink tracksuit, coffee cup in hand, her expression a mask of barely suppressed fury. Her phone was out, undoubtedly recording. I gave her a polite, neighborly wave. She did not reciprocate. As the trench deepened, running parallel to her fence, we began to notice certain irregularities. The footings for her fence posts, where they were briefly exposed by the collapsing edge of the trench on my side, appeared remarkably shallow. The posts themselves seemed to be set in a haphazard mix of dry concrete and hope. One of my crew, old Hank, a man who'd forgotten more about construction than Eleanor would ever know, spat expressively. "Cheap job, boss," he muttered, loud enough for me, and perhaps a sensitive microphone, to hear. "Wouldn't trust that thing in a high wind, let alone next to proper groundwork." Around mid-morning, as the Surgeon worked its way along a section directly abutting the longest stretch of her fence, it happened. There was no sudden impact, no direct contact from my equipment. Just the subtle, persistent vibration of 12,000 pounds of machinery working nearby, the shifting of earth lawfully removed on my side of the line. A distinct sagging became visible in one panel of her fence. Then another. A faint creaking sound, like a ship in distress, carried on the breeze. Then, with a sigh of tortured vinyl and collapsing ambition, a 20-foot section of Eleanor Ainsworth's magnificent white fence gracefully, almost languidly, slumped sideways and tumbled directly into the trench, on my property. It lay there like a beached whale, exposing her perfectly manicured, now suddenly vulnerable backyard to the rustic charm of my pasture. Eleanor let out a shriek that could curdle milk. "You did that? You deliberately destroyed my fence. I'm calling the police. I'm suing you for everything you own." I signaled my operator to cut the engine. In the sudden silence, I walked calmly to the property line. "Well, Mrs. Ainsworth," I said, my voice resonating with dry concern, "that's most unfortunate. It appears your fence has suffered a catastrophic structural failure. Substandard construction, by the looks of it. Don't worry," I added, gesturing to my crew. "We'll carefully set aside the debris for you. From my property, of course." Her face was a fascinating study in apoplectic rage. The game had just changed, dramatically. Eleanor, predictably, unleashed the hounds of bureaucratic war. Within hours, a sheriff's deputy was at my gate, summoned by a frantic Eleanor claiming deliberate destruction of property. I met him calmly, presented my county-issued excavation permit, the surveyor's plat map clearly showing the work was entirely on my land, and explained the unfortunate, but entirely coincidental, collapse of Mrs. Ainsworth's poorly constructed fence. The deputy, a young man with seen-it-all eyes, listened patiently, glanced at the collapsed fence, then at my permits. He sighed. "Ma'am," he said to Eleanor, who was vibrating with indignation on her side of the now gaping hole, "he's on his own property, with valid permits. Looks like your fence just fell down. This is a civil matter, if anything." He tipped his hat to me and departed, leaving Eleanor sputtering. Next came the threatening letters from her lawyer, a slick downtown type whose letterhead screamed billable hours. He demanded immediate replacement of the fence, damages for emotional distress, and a public apology. Marcus, my cousin, chuckled when I forwarded it. "Amateur hour," he said. "Send him our surveyor's report detailing the shallow footings and the encroachment. Add a few photos of the shoddy materials, and remind him gently about the concept of contributory negligence." We did. We also included a bill for my crew's time in carefully removing and stacking the debris of her fence from my trench. The counter-response from her lawyer was notably more subdued. The HOA board, meanwhile, was in a quiet panic. Marcus had sent them a courtesy copy of our correspondence, along with a polite inquiry as to whether the HOA's insurance covered damages resulting from a board president's personal vendettas or the failure of structures built in violation of common sense, if not specific bylaws. The whispers and whispering pines grew louder. Several neighbors, emboldened by Eleanor's very public fence fail, contacted me directly. Old Mr. Henderson from down the cul-de-sac recounted how Eleanor had forced him to repaint his mailbox 3 times to achieve the correct shade of Whispering Pines beige. A young couple, the Garcias, told me about the fines they'd received for their children's brightly colored swing set, deemed visually disruptive. Digit, my tech-savvy ally, compiled these anecdotes into a discreet but damning dossier. Public opinion, even in the carefully controlled environment of Whispering Pines, was beginning to turn. Eleanor's fence hadn't just collapsed. Her credibility was crumbling with it. The legal fees for the HOA were mounting, and for what? A gate that offended one woman's sensibilities, and a fence that couldn't stand up to a stiff breeze, let alone the perfectly legal operations of a neighboring ranch. The narrative was shifting, no longer about my aggressive gate, but about her aggressive overreach. The next HOA monthly meeting, usually a somnolent affair focused on lawn maintenance schedules, and the annual petunia budget, promised to be significantly more engaging. Marcus and I had ensured our little fence dispute, and Eleanor's broader conduct was on the agenda. We arrived a few minutes early. The community clubhouse was more crowded than I'd ever seen it. Word had clearly spread. Eleanor Ainsworth sat at the head table, flanked by the other, visibly uncomfortable, board members. She shot me a look that could strip paint. I offered a bland, neutral smile. When our agenda item came up, Marcus rose. He didn't grandstand. He didn't raise his voice. He simply, methodically, laid out the facts. The initial, vague notice about my gate, our requests for clarification, Eleanor's escalation, the fines, the trespassing. He presented the county permits for my excavation work. He showed large, clear photographs of the collapsed fence, the ridiculously shallow footings, the cheap materials. He then presented the surveyor's report, indicating that portions of Eleanor's fence had, in fact, been encroaching slightly onto my property for years. "This isn't about a gate, ladies and gentlemen," Marcus concluded, his calm voice carrying through the suddenly silent room. "This is about a pattern of behavior. It's about the selective enforcement of vaguely worded rules. It's about one individual using the HOA's authority to pursue personal grievances at considerable legal expense to this community." Then, he invited Mr. Henderson to speak. The elderly gentleman, trembling slightly but resolute, described his mailbox ordeal. The Garcias followed, talking about the swing set. One by one, a half-dozen other residents stood up, sharing their own stories of Eleanor's petty tyrannies, of fines for bird feeders deemed unnatural, or warnings for trash cans left out 10 minutes past the arbitrary deadline. Digit, from the back of the room, projected onto a blank wall a series of slides, screenshots of Eleanor's own minor infractions, gleaned from public records and neighborhood watch forums. Her prize roses encroaching on common land, her sprinkler system consistently overwatering the sidewalk, a small, unpermitted shed tucked behind her garage. The cumulative effect was devastating. Eleanor attempted to interrupt, to object, her voice rising in pitch and indignation. "This is an outrage, a personal attack. These are lies and distortions." But her protests were drowned out by the murmur of the crowd. Her face, usually a mask of serene control, was flushed and contorted. The carefully constructed edifice of her authority was visibly cracking, much like her fence. The other board members looked at each other, then at the angry faces in the audience, then at the mounting pile of evidence. The treasurer, a timid man named Arthur, cleared his throat. "Eleanor," he began, perhaps it's time we considered a review of these matters." It was the beginning of the end for her reign. Her public unraveling was as spectacular, in its way, as the collapse of her vinyl monument to bad judgment. The fallout from that HOA meeting was swift and decisive. Faced with a room full of angry residents, incontrovertible evidence of her overreach, and the quiet, steely determination of Marcus and myself, the board had little choice. A motion of no confidence in Eleanor Ainsworth as president was proposed by Arthur, the once timid treasurer. It passed with only one dissenting vote, Eleanor's own, a last, futile gesture of defiance. She didn't resign in disgrace. She was summarily stripped of her title, her gavel metaphorically prized from her white-knuckled grip. The Whispering Pines HOA, shaken to its beige core, immediately moved to freeze all pending fines and legal actions related to her vendettas, and initiated a full review of its bylaws and enforcement procedures. My ranch gate, the original casus belli, remained untouched, a silent, gray sentinel of defiance. It had become something of a local landmark, a symbol that, even in the most meticulously planned communities, common sense and determined resistance could prevail. I chose not to rebuild any part of Eleanor's fence, of course. That was her responsibility. However, on my side of the property line, where the trench for my new, highly effective French drain now lay neatly covered and seeded, I installed a simple, sturdy post-and-wire fence, agricultural grade, purely functional, and entirely compliant with nothing but my own requirements. It was a subtle but clear statement. This is where my land begins, and your regulations end. The atmosphere in Whispering Pines changed palpably. Neighbors started talking to each other more, questioning directives, even, dare I say, exhibiting flashes of individuality in their landscaping. The fear of arbitrary censure had lifted. my family life, which had been under a low-level siege mentality, returned to its normal rhythm. Laura planted a new bed of wildflowers near the gate, a splash of vibrant, untamed color against the battleship gray. The kids rode their bikes down the long driveway without fear of a scolding for unauthorized recreational activity. The cost of standing up had been a calculated expenditure of time, resources, and resolve. The reward was peace, the restoration of boundaries, and the quiet, deeply satisfying knowledge that justice, sometimes, can be delivered with the precision of a well-calibrated excavator and the unassailable logic of a well-argued legal brief. That gate, my gate, was no longer just an entryway. It was a testament. A part of the Thorn Ranch legacy, forged in steel and righteous indignation. And as for neighborly relations, well, Mrs. Ainsworth eventually put up a new fence, a cheaper one, this time. And, I noted with a certain grim satisfaction, entirely on her own property. The new equilibrium settled over Whispering Pines, like a fresh coat of sensibly hued, mutually agreed-upon paint. Eleanor Ainsworth faded into the background, a diminished figure, occasionally seen power-walking the cul-de-sacs, with a thunderous expression, but her power to inflict misery via bylaw was gone. The HOA, under new, more circumspect leadership, began a slow process of untangling the more draconian and ambiguous clauses she had woven into its fabric. My gate stood, proud and unmolested. It had, in a small way, become a teaching tool. Other residents, when facing what they felt was unreasonable HOA pressure, would sometimes drive past it, a slow pilgrimage to a symbol of successful defiance. Marcus had a few new clients from Whispering Pines, homeowners suddenly emboldened to question outdated restrictions or unfair assessments. He handled them with his usual cool competence, ensuring that the HOA's newfound reasonableness was consistently applied. Digit, my eccentric information guru, found a new hobby, attending HOA meetings as an observer, his mere presence, a silent reminder that transparency was no longer optional. He'd occasionally send me cryptic emails with subject lines like beige alert level downgraded or petunia compliance achieved. My property drainage system worked flawlessly. A hidden network ensuring the stability of my land, a quiet metaphor for the underlying legal and logical framework that had secured my victory. The surgeon, the compact excavator, went back to its more conventional duties, building infrastructure that served communities rather than dismantling the pretensions of petty tyrants, though I confess I sometimes patted its hydraulic arm with a certain fondness, remembering its brief, glorious role in suburban warfare. The moral of the story, if there is one, isn't complex. It's about knowing your rights, understanding the rules of engagement, and being prepared to defend your boundaries, whether they're marked by a steel gate or the simple expectation of privacy and respect. It's about recognizing that sometimes the most effective response to absurdity is not to argue with it, but to methodically, legally, and if necessary, physically, dismantle its foundations. The quiet satisfaction of seeing Eleanor's fence in a heap was surpassed only by the deeper contentment of restoring a measure of sanity to our corner of the world. My ranch was once again a sanctuary, its borders secure, its legacy intact. And the gate, well, the gate just looked like a gate again, albeit one with a hell of a backstory.